I stopped updating a Windows computer completely on purpose and left it running for months while every single security patch Microsoft released just piled up untouched. What happened to that machine was worse than I expected in some ways, and honestly less dramatic than I expected in others, and by the end of this video you'll know exactly what's waiting for you if you've ever clicked remind me later one too many times. Let me set up exactly what I did because the setup matters here. I took a Windows machine, disconnected Windows Update entirely, and simply let it sit and operate normally for an extended stretch of time, using it the way an average person actually uses a computer, browsing, opening files, running everyday programs, while quietly documenting everything that changed underneath the surface. I wanted to answer a question most people never actually test for themselves. Does ignoring updates really matter as much as every tech channel and IT department claims it does? Or is most of that warning just fear-mongering designed to make people feel guilty about a notification they dismissed? The first thing worth understanding before we even get to what I observed is what a Windows update actually contains, because most people picture it as some vague, abstract improvement rather than what it really is. Every security update Microsoft ships is a direct response to a specific identified weakness somewhere in the operating system's code, a flaw that security researchers and sometimes attackers themselves have already discovered. Microsoft essentially publishes a map of exactly what was broken and exactly how they fixed it. That's the uncomfortable part almost nobody talks about. The moment a patch ships, criminals immediately have a blueprint showing them precisely where unpatched systems are still vulnerable. Skipping that single update doesn't just mean missing out on an improvement. It means leaving a specifically documented, publicly known hole in your defenses wide open, and increasingly automated tools exist specifically to scan the internet hunting for exactly those holes. For the first few weeks of my test, honestly, nothing dramatic happened at all, and I think this is exactly why so many people convince themselves updates don't really matter. The machine ran fine, programs opened normally, nothing crashed, nothing looked obviously wrong, and if you'd handed me this laptop blind, I wouldn't have been able to tell you it hadn't been patched in weeks just by looking at it. That's actually the most dangerous part of the entire experience, and it's worth sitting with for a second. An unpatched system doesn't announce itself. There's no flashing warning telling you a vulnerability sitting on your machine has already been published in security bulletins, cataloged by number, and is actively being scanned for by bots crawling the internet around the clock looking for exactly this kind of exposed target. Around the 1 month mark is when I started noticing the practical friction creeping in, the stuff that doesn't show up in security reports but genuinely affects how usable the machine feels day to day. A couple of applications started throwing compatibility warnings I hadn't seen before. Nothing catastrophic, just small friction that reminded me the rest of the software ecosystem keeps assuming you're running a reasonably current, patched version of Windows underneath it. Browser extensions flagged warnings about outdated system components. One piece of software refused to install entirely until I updated certain underlying frameworks that normally get refreshed automatically through routine Windows updates. None of this was catastrophic on its own, but it painted a clear picture. The rest of the software world doesn't wait for you, it keeps moving forward, assuming your operating system is moving with it, and the gap between an unpatched machine and everything built to run on top of it only widens with time. The security side of this experiment is where things genuinely got uncomfortable, and where I think most people underestimate the actual mechanics of what's happening. Security researchers and IT professionals have documented repeatedly that a huge share of ransomware and malware campaigns specifically target systems running outdated Windows versions, not because attackers are being lazy, but because it's simply the highest probability, lowest effort path to a successful breach. Attackers already know exactly which vulnerabilities exist in unpatched systems because Microsoft's own security bulletins effectively hand them the information the moment a patch ships. Running my test machine unpatched for an extended period meant it was sitting there, connected to the internet, matching the exact Profile automated attack tools are specifically built to hunt for. I didn't get hit with anything catastrophic during my specific test window, which honestly says more about luck and the relatively short duration of my experiment than it does about the machine actually being safe. Here's a specific, very current example that makes this risk feel less abstract and a lot more real. Right now, in 2026, Microsoft is in the middle of a massive, largely invisible security transition tied to something called Secure Boot, a feature built into virtually every PC sold since around 2012 that verifies your bootloader hasn't been tampered with before Windows even finishes starting up. The certificates protecting that system since 2011 are expiring, and Microsoft has been quietly pushing replacement certificates through routine Windows updates for months. If your machine never receives those updates, your PC will still boot and still run. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface, but Microsoft has been explicit that unpatched devices will permanently lose the ability to receive future protections against boot-level threats, including updates. Two malware blacklists designed to stop known threats like the Blacklist bootkit from hijacking your system before your antivirus software even has a chance to load. That's the kind of consequence that never shows up as an error message. It just quietly, permanently locks you out of protections everyone else keeps getting without you ever realizing what you lost. I also want to be completely honest about the parts of this experiment that didn't match the doom and gloom you sometimes hear online. My test machine didn't spontaneously get infected with some dramatic virus during the window I tested. It didn't suddenly slow to a crawl or become unusable overnight. If your entire mental model of skipping updates is my computer will immediately explode, that's simply not accurate, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The real risk isn't a single dramatic moment, it's a slowly widening window of exposure that compounds the longer you leave it open, combined with rising practical friction as the rest of the software ecosystem quietly moves on without you. Nothing about my test machine screamed danger. That's precisely the problem, because real attackers aren't looking for computers that scream danger. They're looking for exactly the kind of quiet, invisible vulnerability I was sitting on the entire time. There's also a compounding effect worth understanding, because updates don't exist as isolated, independent events. They build directly on top of each other. Missing one update doesn't just leave you exposed to whatever that specific patch addressed. It also means every subsequent update assumes you're starting from a baseline you no longer actually have. The longer a system goes unpatched, the more updates pile up waiting to be applied, and the more likely you are to eventually hit compatibility conflicts, failed installations, or update processes that simply refuse to complete cleanly because too many intermediate steps got skipped along the way. I've watched this happen to real machines brought in for repair. A computer left unpatched for a year or more sometimes genuinely struggles to catch back up, requiring a clean reinstall rather than a simple round of updates, specifically because the gap between where the system currently sits and where it needs to be has grown too large for a normal update to safely bridge. Let's talk in more detail about exactly what kind of vulnerabilities we're actually discussing here, because throwing around the word vulnerability without specifics makes it too easy to dismiss as abstract tech jargon. Windows security updates typically patch things like privilege escalation flaws, where a piece of malware that manages to sneak onto your machine with limited permissions can exploit a flaw to gain full administrator control. Instead, they patch remote code execution vulnerabilities where an attacker doesn't even need physical access to your machine, just the ability to get you to open a malicious file, visit a compromised web page, or in some particularly nasty cases, simply have your machine connected to a network where the exploit can trigger without any action from you at all. They patch flaws in how Windows handles network protocols, printer drivers, even the fonts your system renders on screen, because historically attackers have found creative ways to weaponize functionality nobody would ever suspect could be dangerous. Each of these categories represents a genuinely different way into your system, and a single missed update can leave more than one of these doors sitting wide open simultaneously during my test. I also paid close attention to what was happening at the browser level because for most people, the browser is actually the primary battlefield where these risks play out in practice, more than the operating system itself in isolation. Modern browsers depend heavily on underlying operating system components for things like certificate validation, encryption libraries, and secure communication protocols when Windows falls behind on updates. Some of those underlying components fall behind too, even if your browser itself claims to be fully updated. I noticed my test browser began flagging certain secure sites with warnings it hadn't shown before, specifically related to outdated system-level cryptographic libraries that hadn't been refreshed through the Windows updates I was deliberately skipping. That's a genuinely uncomfortable discovery because it means even diligently updating your browser on its own isn't a complete substitute for keeping the underlying operating system patched. The two layers depend on each other more than most people realize. I also want to walk through what this looks like specifically for anyone running a small business or managing even a handful of computers, because the stakes shift considerably once you're not just protecting your own personal files. IT professionals who handle ransomware recovery consistently report that unpatched systems are disproportionately represented among the machines they're called in to fix after a serious incident, and the financial damage extends well beyond just the cost of data recovery itself. Businesses hit with ransomware often face operational downtime while systems get restored, potential legal exposure if customer data was compromised, in the breach, and in some cases, regulatory fines depending on the industry and what kind of information was exposed. A single unpatched machine sitting on a business network doesn't just put that one computer at risk, it can become the entry point attackers use to move laterally across an entire connected network, turning one overlooked update notification into a company-wide crisis that started from a single machine nobody thought was important enough to keep current. Let's also address a question I know some of you are already thinking, because it came up constantly while I was researching this experiment. What about people who deliberately avoid updates because a past update broke something on their machine or introduced a bug that made their computer worse rather than better? This is a legitimate concern, and it's not paranoia. It's happened. Occasionally, a Windows update does introduce compatibility issues with specific hardware or software configurations. But the solution to that problem isn't avoiding updates entirely. It's understanding that Microsoft typically resolves these issues within days or weeks through follow-up patches, and the security cost of skipping updates indefinitely to avoid a temporary compatibility hiccup is almost always dramatically worse than the inconvenience of dealing with an occasional bug. If you've been burned before, a smarter approach is delaying updates by a short window, a week or two at most, to let obvious problems surface and get fixed by others first, rather than opting out of the update process entirely and leaving yourself exposed indefinitely. Something else worth mentioning from my test that surprised me: I expected the operating system itself to be the primary source of friction as time went on, but a genuinely significant portion of the compatibility problems I ran into actually came from third-party software quietly assuming a reasonably current, patched Windows environment underneath it. Certain applications performed version checks I hadn't anticipated, refusing to run certain features until specific underlying system components were updated. Driver compatibility became a growing headache too, since manufacturers regularly release updated drivers that assume you're running on a current, patched foundation, and running increasingly outdated drivers on an increasingly outdated operating system compounds the kind of instability that eventually shows up as random crashes or hardware that mysteriously stops working correctly for no obvious reason. Now let's talk about what actually protects you, because after running this entire experiment, I don't think the answer is complicated. It's just consistently ignored. Setting Windows Update to install automatically rather than manually checking and dismissing notifications removes the human hesitation that causes most people to fall behind in the first place. Windows lets you schedule active hours so updates and restarts happen outside the times you're actually using your machine. meaning you genuinely don't need to experience the interruption that makes people avoid updating in the first place. For anyone specifically worried about a bad update breaking something important, keeping regular backups of critical files solves that problem far more effectively than avoiding updates altogether, since backups protect you from update issues and from the vastly more common and more damaging scenario of ransomware or hardware failure. And if you're still running an operating system, version approaching its actual end of support, the honest, unavoidable answer is that upgrading isn't optional forever. It's a deadline that eventually arrives whether you've prepared for it or not. One more thing worth being straightforward about, because I think it's the part most videos on this topic skip entirely: updating consistently isn't just about you individually. Every unpatched machine connected to the Internet is a small contribution to the overall pool of vulnerable systems attackers can exploit, sometimes to build the exact kind of botnets used to launch larger attacks against completely unrelated targets. Keeping your own machine updated isn't purely self-interested, it's a small but genuinely meaningful piece of collective internet security, the same way getting a vaccine protects people beyond just yourself. That's not a guilt trip, it's just an honest, often overlooked part of the full picture that rarely gets mentioned alongside the usual personal risk framing. If this kind of honest, hands-on tech testing is what you come here for, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep doing these kinds of real experiments instead of just repeating the same recycled advice everyone else copies and pastes. And subscribe if you want to see more of these deep, tested breakdowns before the next one drops. Let's talk about the specific deadline that makes this experiment particularly relevant too. Record right now, because the timing genuinely matters. Windows 10 support officially ended in October 2025, and while Microsoft extended free security updates for some users through an extended security updates program running until October 2027, that's a temporary bridge, not a permanent solution. If you're still running Windows 10 and haven't enrolled in that program, or if you're running certain Windows 11 versions approaching their own support cutoffs, you're looking at the exact scenario I deliberately created for this test, except it wouldn't be an experiment for you, it would just be your actual daily reality. Once official support genuinely ends for a specific Windows version, Microsoft stops shipping any new security patches for it entirely, meaning every single vulnerability discovered after that date remains permanently open on your machine forever unless you eventually upgrade. I also spent some time during this test specifically looking at what IT professionals and repair technicians see on a regular basis with real customers running genuinely outdated, unpatched systems, because my controlled test window was relatively short compared to what happens to machines left unpatched for years in the real world. The pattern technicians describe repeatedly is remarkably consistent: outdated, unpatched. Windows machines are disproportionately represented among the computers brought in for ransomware recovery, malware removal, and identity theft cleanup. Attackers specifically target unpatched systems because the vulnerabilities are already documented and the exploitation tools already exist, freely available, requiring minimal technical skill to actually deploy against a matching target. Data recovery after a serious ransomware attack routinely costs, well, over $1,000, sometimes running into the thousands, and recovery isn't even guaranteed to work. Compare that to the actual cost of staying updated: a few minutes of waiting, occasionally a restart you didn't want at that exact moment. The math genuinely isn't close once you actually run the comparison honestly. So here's my honest verdict after actually living through this experiment instead of just repeating warnings I'd heard secondhand. Skipping updates for a short window, a few days, even a couple of weeks, probably won't destroy your life, and I think a lot of the internet's messaging around this topic leans too dramatic for that specific scenario. But the risk isn't linear, it compounds, and it compounds in ways that are specifically invisible until the exact moment they aren't. Every week you go without patching is another week your machine matches the precise profile automated attack tools are built to find. Another week the gap between your system and everything built to run on top of it quietly widens, and another week closer to a support deadline that, once crossed, means some of those vulnerabilities never get fixed again, period, permanently, unless you upgrade to something newer. Looking back on the whole experiment, there's one more layer worth mentioning that I didn't fully appreciate until I'd actually lived through it rather than just reading about it secondhand. The psychological experience of running an unpatched machine is genuinely strange because everything feels fine, right? Up until the moment it doesn't, and there's no reliable warning sign in between. I found myself checking for signs of trouble that simply weren't there to see, because the entire danger of an unpatched system is that it's invisible by design. Malware built to exploit a known vulnerability doesn't announce itself before it strikes. It waits patiently until it's given the opportunity, and a system that's been sitting unpatched for weeks or months represents exactly the kind of opportunity these tools are specifically engineered to find. That invisible quality is precisely why so many people convince themselves the warnings are overblown, because their own lived experience during the exposure window genuinely doesn't feel dangerous, right up until the specific moment it becomes a serious problem for someone. I'll also say plainly that if I were running this experiment again with more time and resources, I'd push the test window considerably longer, because the real damage from skipping updates isn't really measured in weeks, it's measured in months and years, as the gap between your system and the current security baseline keeps widening and the number of unpatched, publicly documented vulnerabilities sitting on your machine keeps accumulating. A short test window like mine genuinely understates the risk compared to what happens to real machines left unpatched indefinitely in the real world, the kind IT professionals see coming through their doors on a weekly basis, often with damage that's already been done by the time anyone notices something is wrong. So here's the bottom line after actually testing this, instead of just repeating what everyone else says. Windows updates are not busy work, and they are not Microsoft trying to annoy you into submission. Every single one closes a specific documented hole that someone somewhere has already found a way to exploit, and the vulnerabilities being patched today are being actively searched for by automated tools scanning the internet right now, this very moment, looking for exactly the kind of unpatched target I deliberately built for this test. The good news, and I want to end on this because it genuinely is good news, is that fixing this problem costs you almost nothing. Turn on automatic updates, set your active hours so restarts happen when you're not using the machine, and stopped reading that little notification bubble like an inconvenience standing between you and whatever you were doing. It's doing more work protecting you than you probably ever gave it credit for. And now, having actually watched what happens when nobody's doing that work at all, I think that credit is genuinely well earned. If you want to see more real, tested experiments like this one instead of recycled advice copied from the same 5 articles everyone else quotes, make sure you're subscribed because there's more of this coming. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.